So welcome to this event, which is co-sponsored by the Migration Communities.
Migration Citizenship Communities Research Group, which exists.
Which does exist
at
the university.
Yeah.
And the Politics of Disorder Research Group as well. So, I mean, we decided to put on this roundtable as a sort of taster session to some extent, or a precursor to the documentary that's going to be shown at 5:30. And we're very fortunate to have the director with us this afternoon, Sai Sun Lu. I hope I pronounced that reasonably correctly, thanks. Yes, and the documentary and Miles to Go Before I Sleep, which really tells the tale, well, a harrowing tale to some extent of the dark side of migration, particularly as it pertains to Taiwan, and leads to many kind of questions around migration, refugee status, and all the types of social injustice and inequalities that are associated with that, both in Taiwan. But the idea of this panel was to kind of broaden that out for a bit more of a sort of more general and global perspective. And there's a series of questions that I've asked the panel to reflect on today. And but before that, I will introduce our panel. First of all, welcome Dr. Isabel Cockle from the University of Portsmouth. Isabel is a senior lecturer at the University of Portsmouth. She got a doctoral degree from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and previously taught at the School of East Asian Studies at Sheffield University. And she's currently the Secretary General of the European Association of Taiwan Studies and a research associate at the Centre of Taiwan Studies as well. And she's very well published in the fields of kind of migration and in relation to Taiwanese studies. And I'm sure you're going to speak sort of specifically more to the sort of the regional angle in the questions that we're going to look at. We're delighted to also present two close colleagues from the School of Social and Political Sciences, Dr. Soraya Sommes-Effa. Is that right?
I thought you forgot my name.
Well, actually, the problem was I got Mike first and then you, but you're sitting in the wrong order. So apologies for that. Soraya is a senior lecturer in international relations, who research focuses on the legal studies of the rights of migrant workers. So I don't think there's anyone better we could have had actually to come and discuss these issues at this round table. Her work explores policymaking procedures, states and international organisations' attitudes towards the legal status and rights of migrant workers, and problematises the legal terminology that's used in policy documents. And she's the author of Rights of Migrant Workers, an analysis of migration policies in contemporary Turkey, that was published in 2021, a couple of years ago. So, finally, but last but not least, Dr. Mike Slaven, a senior lecturer in international relations as well, who, again, researches immigration and security politics, and Mike also, in a lot of his research, is also drawing his own professional background in relation to US policy makers and US politics and why US policymakers approach the governance of migration in certain ways. Mike's book, Securing Borders, Securing Power, The Rise and Decline of Arizona Border Politics, was published by Columbia University Press last year, and that focuses on immigration politics in the US, particularly the US-Mexican border. So, without any further ado, what I've asked the panel to do is kind of reflect on about three questions. I sort of said about maximum 10 minutes each, 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll also offer the panelists to kind of respond to each other as before opening up for Q&A. So the questions that we set ourselves are: what are the current challenges in global migration? What are the myths and realities of migration, with perhaps a focus on the lived experience here as well? And how can the challenges and distortions of discourse in migration be addressed in policy terms? So are we happy to go in the order that I just introduced you? So Isabel, are you happy to go first? Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I couldn't be happier to come here all the way from Portsmouth. It was an excruciating journey trying to understand whether the train is running or not, and when the train didn't run, and what can you do? So yeah, I took taxi Luckily, not all the way. And I prepared slides. I know we're not going to use slides, but I thought, oh, I'll show you the lovely HMS Warrior. That's what I took this morning at 6:50 a.m. But no, we're not using slides. I'm just having it here for myself. So yeah, we're asked to address missed realities and current challenges. So that what I'm going to present is how I understood it from mostly from the context of Taiwan. First of all, I think to me the biggest myth is that people can be categorized. By that I mean when people are on the move, when they enter different states, then they're being categorized, and with the legal implications that they are either student, they are the spouse, such as myself, a worker, and then there may be refugees. So each of the category is associated with a certain group of rights, or rather lack of. But then I also thought it's very interesting that some people seem to be beyond the categorization. So those people who have more capital, or people who are richer, very bluntly put, they are more, they have more room to maneuver across those categories. And sometimes professionals, those so-called highly skilled workers, seem to be also across the category. And then I found, interestingly, categorization also applies to migrant workers, because I study migrant workers. I found that their categorization is usually very rigid. So in the case of Taiwan, that means that their categorization attached to their jobs, that they are either work in construction, farming, manufacturing, not so much, not yet in the case of Taiwan, hospitality, but a lot in the care work or domestic work. So their work can be categorized. And then I found a second myth is that the people's mobility can be controlled. People's mobility can be restricted, and mostly this occurs when people try to cross state borders. So the way to control it, to restrict it, is by issuing a passport. Sometimes, I guess for people in this country to think that applying a passport is a privilege is difficult to comprehend. But when you hear what migrant workers tell you, that even to have a passport at hand, and a passport, that piece of document itself also shows that you are a migrant worker, I think that means a lot about how the state, the sending state and also the receiving state, trying to use passport and visa as a way to restrict people's mobility. And I found my research I did during the pandemic is that the health examination can be also used to restrict people's mobility. You have to be certain, you have to pass the health examination in order to move. But again, that can be waived if you're from a global north. So I found that very interesting. And mobility behind the borders can be also restricted. And again, in the case of Taiwan, that means your geographical movement, your spatial movement. If you work in a factory and you are controlled by the factory's micro regime, or if you work as a domestic worker, then you'll be much controlled by your employers. And what I found interesting is that digital connection can also become either a resource or a restriction on your mobility. The myth number 3 to me is about labor. Labor, what I can see is labor can be made very cheap, so much so that we also associate a person who provides cheap labor as cheap human being. And that seems to be indicating that labor provision has no cost. If you're a man, if you're a woman, you're having a more or less health body, you can provide that labor, and that labor can be purchased at a certain price, and usually at the very low price, and as if that labor is carefree. So built on this, I think the reality is that the human life is very complicated, it's messy, and it's relational. So when you try to dissect people's human life into categories, then you run into troubles. The students want to work, spouses want to work. Spouses are not just coming here to give birth in the context of Taiwan or South Korea or Japan. But then when they are having those activities beyond the categorization, then the laws seem to be very restrictive and not grant them the right they deserve. In that sense, people are not really categories, people are not legal categories, people are real human beings with a real need, and real sociality. And I found that when we treat people as categories rather than human beings, then inequality can occur, and denial of rights is another problem. And mobility is not free, is not cost-free. People move in order to have a better life or to get away from risk or threat. But when people cannot do that on their own, they rely on help from their friends, their families, or sometimes strangers. So we now see, no matter how we describe refugees, they cannot do that. They cannot apply for asylum seeking without being helped by someone else. And when that help is provided by a stranger, then we're looking at really a thriving market for human trafficking. And I also found it very interesting that the passport you hold at hand could be a resource. Again, in the context of Taiwan, it's quite interesting. People say, this is a much more useful passport, although this country doesn't exist. So Taiwan, with a Taiwanese passport, you can have a free visa-free landing as a tourist, and allows you to go to probably more than 100 states around the world. But this country doesn't exist, so that's very interesting. And I talked about mobility just now, but digital phone. I found digital mobility is really double-edged sword. It can help a migrant to be very well connected. They can get help by the activists, but the digital connectivity itself can also be a source of harm. Labour, I have said just now, labour is not cheap. Labour does come with a cost, and that cost should be translated into the right to have health care, and also the right to be recognised that the human emotions need to be addressed, particularly those people who provide emotional labour. Domestic workers, care workers are those people who provide emotional labour. And then challenges, as I said just now, I found the strict categorization is an illusion. It's not the reality. A mobility regime built on the control of a border and a passport often leads to the deficiency of rights. And this is most obvious in the guest worker system adopted by Taiwan and Singapore, South Korea and Japan and Hong Kong as well. And that makes human lives almost tagged to a price, and this price has a very strict hierarchy depending on your level of skills and also how you're being categorized by the government. The mobility has become more and more expensive for those people who actually benefit from it, but who cannot afford it. In the case of migrant workers, then the price they pay for being mobile across state border is to have a heavy debt. A heavy debt leads to slavery. In the case of Taiwan, the challenges, and also seeing from the lived experiences, oh dear, I've spoken so much. I'm finishing in 1 minute. Yeah, so the case of Taiwan is that the interest in profit really has outweighed the concern for people's rights. And what is shocking is that there's no political will to tackle this issue. The guest worker system adopted by the Taiwanese government is built on legal servitude. And there's no political will to overcome that problem. So I'll shut up here. I think I've said enough.
Thank you.
Probably we've got quite a few areas that overlap obviously in our research that I kind of look into categorizations as well, but I think I'm going to kind of I'll start from the perhaps challenges first. I don't know, I might move between challenges and myth and some possible solutions or what we can offer actually. But the key features of global migration, international migration, I would argue is that acceleration, globalization, diversification, feminization, politicization. I mean, these are, you may expand these features, but these are some of the key features that that is in literature that we argue. I mean, they're all categories are different areas that have research, deep research within, but some categories, some features that I just mentioned with my research, I touch upon, like gender, for example, perspective with my current research that I'm exploring refugee women's access, the experiences of maternal health care in Turkey, for instance, and there are a lot of overlaps and intersectionality that you can argue. This shows, I think, what Isabel said is the complexity of the categorizations. We categorize in policies, it looks very sleek and clean categorizations, but the lines are really blurred when you get into the categories, and then especially when you start talking about and looking into their rights, it becomes more complex. And there are the mobility is a fluid concept, but this movement between these categories is quite interestingly fluid as well. And if I may look at the politicization, which is one of the really problematic area, I should say, although I don't like to use problem and migration next to each other, which is one of the areas that I, that I don't like to see next to each other, because I don't see migration and movement as a problem to be solved. But politicization becomes really important and embedded in the terminology that we actually generate and start to generate mental polarizations first, and then they become tangible polarizations through the policies as well. Or sometimes policies feed the mental polarizations and create actually these divisions in our minds, and then we actually start to have parallel lives, as infamous Casey review would argue, which has really problems with him. Which kind of may lead to a narrative that is negative, that it has got negative connotations to migration, which is really takes away, I would argue, from the human rights discourse, takes away the rights, right to have rights, as Seyla Benabi would say. It takes away that essence from migratory movements, from migrants. And a migrant, as an umbrella term, would have the dichotomous kind of categories, different touch upon categories, maybe moving away from labor categories, but it is who is deserving the rights. Economic migrants versus refugees, for example. One has got a humanitarian touch, but economic migrants, how would we be sure that the economic migrant is not actually have a humanitarian root cause for migration as well? And it becomes more difficult actually to distinguish these categories. I mean, from my field work, the case in Turkey, for example, I came across refugees, interviewed the policymakers, and that looked into the laws, actually, the legislation that looks into, especially Syrian refugees, who are the highest number of refugee population in Turkey at the moment. And they flee the conflict. They find refuge in a safe country, a neighboring country, and after 6 months legally, they go under temporary protection, not a refugee protection, not under Geneva Convention, because Turkey is not abstains from the geographic kind of territory element into it. So they only accept European refugees from European as refugee. So they give kind of a protection through temporary protection, but they join labor market. So what does make them actually refugees and workers? And how would you move away from refugee status to economic migrant, because they are in the labor force now? which kind of law covers their rights and how would you define their status? So that becomes really blur. So I came across the similar situation in my, I just finished a research and looked into COVID-19 impact on the labour market in the UK. So I came across this a group of refugee migrants, refugee doctors actually. And then this blurred line between the categories came to surface again. So, and you ask, okay, we had these focus group conversations with refugee doctors, and then you say, okay, you're a refugee, and you've got this profession that you really would like to practice, but there are legal restrictions that prevents you because of your refugee-ness. But yes, I mean, after 12 months, even if you're asylum seeker, you can practice, you can work. But are you aware of your rights? That's another issue. So when we have this politicization, as I'm focusing on at the moment, it becomes really difficult in terms of the transform the narrative from the negative and derogatory and demonization of the migrant status in general and categories in particular, some categories in particular, but to actually move towards a rights-based approach. That's what is lacking actually. One of the key challenges that we're having, politicization with the far right movements that are endemic in many places, including in Turkey. We may call it differently, but in Turkey there are obviously anti-immigrant issues that are going on as well. Once the media was putting headlines saying that how generous we are, the open border policy. Now, last couple of years, we see really anti-immigrant and very negative derogatory terminology that going around, and very restrictive policies that are coming. And we already have got millions of refugees residing in the country. So that takes us to international law and what covenants actually cover the legal status and the protection, what protection that needs to be given actually to these migrants. I say migrants because I think all individuals should have rights, and under the human rights perspective, I would say freedom of movement is a human right. So doesn't matter what category that you're opting for or you're forced into. We got something called forced migration for all sorts of reasons. We had global health crisis, we have climate change, we have conflicts that continuously happening. So we've got countries, we've got a modern nation state system and borders that are not really catering this changing dynamics anymore, which is in crisis at the moment, that we need to kind of rethink and revisit these concept of sovereignty, responsibility, state responsibility, who is responsible for the refugees in the camps, for example, in the third areas, zones, safe zones, what jurisdiction covers these zones, for example. So it becomes really more and more complex. As I'm talking and hearing myself, it becomes really complex. We need to kind of, I think, be aware of how we generate these terminologies, these terms in legal papers, in policies, in the media, and what is feeding, what is creating these narratives actually, and how we can move from restrictive policies or derogatory type of language towards more rights-based approach. I think that's one of the areas that I would like to see that is transformation that is happening. So I think, do I have right? No? Do I have right? Do I have time?
You have the right to one
Yeah,
minute.
right. Yeah. So I think one of the so I think that even the most you know, states that they're calling themselves democratic, liberal, or even not, well, non-liberal states as well. Some of them recognize the international conventions and protection mechanisms. Recognize it. Yes, that's right. But implementation becomes really muddy when you see these zones where I'm talking about refugees, but I couldn't even get into the domestic policies. I don't have time. But how we actually create protection mechanisms under what jurisdiction? We are outsourcing it. We are deterritorialization. I think that's the term that is being used now. And it doesn't go. It is international community's responsibility. But who is the international community? You know, who is a part of the international community? So it becomes really blurred in a way when you think about the migration and the global challenges and the way in which these people are, the creation of new human statuses, like IDPs, like refugees, like economic migrants. You can extend the diverse statuses that we have. But how we manage that. And I think one last thing, we shouldn't be seeing migration as a problem to be solved. I think that's the core of the issue that we have.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks very much for that very thought-provoking. Yeah, thanks. I'm looking forward to the film. I'm going to have probably the most general comments because Soraya knows a lot more about migrant workers than me. Isabel knows a lot more about Taiwan. I know embarrassingly little about Taiwan, and I say embarrassingly because I have a brother who's lived there for 12 years. But all I know about migration in Taiwan is through his anecdotal experience, so I have no other frame of reference. I'm going to go over, I think, 5 myths, which will hopefully get on to realities and challenges. We didn't coordinate our myths ahead of time, so I think they'll be largely consistent with everything that's been said already in ways that should become evident. The first myth that I kind of want to challenge, I don't think of myths as things that are necessarily totally untrue, but they kind of combine various elements of fiction and truth and are part of the narrative, is that we are living in a new global migration world now that's in some way fundamentally different from before. I ask my students this, and I'm going to exclude the other panelists because they have a high probability of knowing the answer. But how many people in the world, as a percentage of the world population, live in a country that's not the one where they were born? Does anyone know? Or have a guess? Nick, what's your guess?
8%.
Okay. 8%. Any over or under on that? Anyone going to take the over? Over, under? Okay, the answer is 3.5%.
Oh, wow.
Right? So, like about 1 in 30 people or so live in a country where they weren't born. You compare that to a place like the UK, and that's up. That is up, right? So from 2000, it was about 2.7% or 2.6%. Or 2.8%, somewhere in there. But so it has increased as a portion of the world population. That's still a lot of people in the world. So this is not to trivialize it, right? But to put it in perspective. And you compare that to a place like the UK, it's gone up from between 8 and 9% 20 years ago to between 15 and 16% now. So yeah, why do I point this out? It's certainly not to trivialize the issue because it is a lot of people. It is a very important social phenomenon. But why is it that we're talking about it so much? And if we think about why we're talking about it so much in a worldwide sense, well, how does that lead us to talk about it? Certainly there's an element probably of Anglosphere bias, right? The United States is the country in the world that has the most immigrants. You also have increases in migration in places like the UK, Australia, and Canada that are noticeable in recent decades. And there's also a northern bias. Though it is certainly not the case that even a majority, I don't know the statistic off the top of my head, it's certainly not the case that a majority of migration is even to global north countries. And what happens when we talk about migration as a global, in a new migration world, when really what's happening is that we're seeing marked increases in this phenomenon in certain places in the world. A lot of countries that have a lot of people and very few people who weren't born there. Places like India and China, the overall foreign-born population is quite small in comparison to a place like the UK, is that we start to imagine as the main character of global migration and controversy, the imagined median voter of one of these immigrant-receiving countries where this is actually a controversy. So if we focus on this global issue as a controversy, but really it's a controversy driven by particular dynamics in particular countries that quite skews the way that we understand it. The second myth, and do stop me by the way, is that in this new globalized world we have walls that are coming down, right? Since the Berlin Wall was torn down, very few border walls have come down. In fact, a lot of border walls have gone up. In a lot of places in the world, not just on the US-Mexico border. You see this in the Zimbabwe and South Africa border, but really places that are not often discussed in the media in the UK. Of course, the other thing is that to note is that this does not steer migration dynamics necessarily, because as Isabel said, migration can't be controlled, right, in that kind of way. So we see the increase of border walls and barriers, not necessarily, of course, at all a decrease in migration, because as I've noted, that has gone up in global terms. Another myth related to the walls is that societies are becoming increasingly anti-immigrant. In a lot of places where you would think this is probably the case based on politics, this is not true. In the United States, the UK, Western Europe, that is not true. Societies, if you look at the polling, are warmer toward immigrants than they ever have been. And this is a long-term trend of increasingly warm attitudes towards immigrants and immigration that has become much more of a 50-50 split in society now, where it used to be like a place in the UK, 80 or 90% of people would respond to a poll and say, yeah, we have too many immigrants. That's no longer the case. Usually public attitudes are actually extremely complex about the situation. People have a number of different coexisting thoughts about what is fair and right when it comes to the way that we treat immigrants. But it is true that people, at least in these countries where you think controversy is overwhelmed the political system, that actually it is not the case that the people are actually more anti-immigrant than before. So what's happening is essentially a different political organization of the issue. As it becomes more important politically, the parties become more homogenous over time in terms of what people within parties think about the issue. It becomes increasingly an issue where the parties contest things, and that's what we're seeing. So a real seesaw sometimes between different partisan views in many of these countries, but not an overall hardening of attitudes. Another myth is that it's the North or these countries, and what's fueled this is that it's really these countries that are kind of overburdened by asylum, right? Which is a main driver of migration dynamics. As has already been intimated, most people who are displaced within their own countries. Most people who are displaced externally or seeking asylum are in the area from which they came. Most people who fled Syria went to Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, not the United Kingdom, right? Not even Germany, even albeit Germany at this stage has a fair number of the global share of Syrian refugees, but certainly nothing close to a majority. And the reality is that many migrations are multifactorial. It is impossible to categorize exactly all of the drivers that are going on. Why people choose to leave, why people stay in a particular place, why people might pick up from that country and go to yet another country. Complex array of things that defy easy categorization, as has already been discussed. Coming on from that, another myth, and this is the last myth, is that we're going to, we inevitably, as the world becomes more contested, climate change happens, and we already have these dynamics. In the North, we're going to inevitably face increasing numbers of refugees, in particular things like climate refugees, right? The idea that climate refugees are going to become a huge deal is not actually the consensus of people who study these topics because of what's already been noted. Most displacement happens internally. most people who leave their country for an array of particular reasons stay within the neighborhood, basically. The people who actually study natural disasters, for example, point out that most people try to stay, or they try to go back, or try to hold on as long as they can. And it's not the case that people will say, okay, well, there's been a flood in my village. I'm going to, pick up and I'm going to go to Germany now. That doesn't happen probably unless you're already in Austria. Why would you ever leave Austria? I don't know. But yeah, and then you'll have trapped populations that are unable to migrate. And certainly there will be an increase probably in migrations where climate and things like that play a role in people's decision making. But again, it'll be way too simple to categorize people as climate refugees in the main probably. And we should resist doing that because that's for instance, a way of addressing the ecological problem that only primes fear and treats immigration as part of this crisis that we're coming into, which I would totally agree with Soraya. We have to be skeptical about any kind of framing about migration as a problem or crisis. And so to conclude from all that is, we need to kind of step away from the myths that cast the kind of frightened northern or western median voter with legitimate concerns as being the main player in how we understand and treat migration, right? Which is very easy to do if we understand migration through the lens of politics or from the perspective of a place like the UK. Instead, and of course we should talk about that politically, but it does not have to be the basis of all intelligent discussion about migration. And instead, try to consider who are the main characters in this, and please center migrants and the many different social functions that they play in society, often at the same time. Something that is definitely not being done by the recent migration policy changes announced here, which I won't get into because I don't have long enough, but we can.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. Thanks, everyone. My original idea was to offer the panelists to sort of have a 1-minute reflection response on the other panelists' thoughts. We've got about 20 minutes though for Q&A. Would you prefer to go straight to Q&A, or do you have a minute's summarization of the reflection on each other's presentations?
Well, I went last, so I think I did that already.
I felt like I did
Okay.
on categorizations as
Okay.
well. So,
All right. In which case, then, I think thanks for. I thought that worked very nicely, going from sort of particular out to the very general there at the end. So I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. We already have one. Is this from online?
Yes. Yeah. Let me see if Christian. Okay, I've just put our audio on. Christian, can you say something?
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you, first of all. Mike, you've just deepened my existential dilemma by saying, why would anybody leave Austria? I don't know what to say. I ask myself that every day, and now. But anyway, I'm trying to sort of formulate what's going through my mind, and it seems sort of there's a common denominator in terms of what you're questioning. So we're questioning legal categories. We're kind of questioning narratives. Soraya, I think we all agree here that the normative case you're making is overwhelming. Everyone in this room will agree with you. But I guess my question is, what do we do in a world where actually that normative case fails to convince growing minorities and soon to be majorities in many parts of the world? What is it that social scientists can do by way of, and now to kind of step into Mike's terrain? I really couldn't agree more with you, Mike, that actually myths sort of tend to have that really uncomfortable tendency to combine an awful lot of fiction with something that is not fictitious, right? I mean, at the very least, perceptions that are very, very real to large numbers of people. So, I mean, I suppose my question really is to all three of you: how do you push through those legal categories, or those normative cases that you're making or challenging? Or how do you push through and beyond the myths that you're summarizing, Mike, in a way that isn't normative itself? Because that normative case we've been making for a long time just hasn't worked. It seems to me we need another approach. We need to take this on empirically. So what are the empirical reasons for questioning the categories, the narratives, and the myths is what I'm getting at, I guess. Thank you. Really enjoyed your talks.
Thanks, Christian. Who would like to go first?
Shall I?
Please.
I think one way that it will sound like utopian whenever I approach to the policymakers and ask about rights of migrants. They say, well, nobody's going to be talking about rights over their state interests and economic interests when you're talking about migrant workers. But I said, well, I mean, we didn't have all these human rights conventions before 1940s, 48. So maybe before that it was utopian, but now we have them. So what I would say is that we should actually imagine things first, and then we should believe that we can change the narrative. But I think we need to go beyond that, and then we need to make that happen in our works, from academic perspective, researcher perspective, I would argue, but at the same time, to make changes in to address what is not working in international law, in terms of implementation. And Michael Doyle, for example, came with this new idea about the international convention, how we can change it to a more look into it more holistically rather than these categories. We need to address and revisit actually Geneva Convention, and which I mean, even the definition of refugee is not really covering the current trends, current changing trends. We need to revisit, because the policy making is an iterative process. As an international community or within states, we continuously revisit these legal conventions or domestic policies as well. I think throughout these iterations, we need to embed rights-based approach. I think from a human rights perspective, I would argue that, and it's and we can start actually. Maybe we already started, but we can start changing the narrative in that way. I don't know whether I answered the question, but maybe it's idealistic, but yeah.
Yeah, to me, I think this question actually speaks to myself, because that's that kind of frustration. Because when you look at the why policies made in a certain way, you understand it. You understand that you want to make profit. You understand that you want to somehow make people cheap in order to make larger profit. But what does that tell us is that when it's done in such a blunt way, so when we talk about whether it's just a myth that the people on the move are now, the number of people on the move is getting bigger, if that strict absolute number doesn't make sense, then let's look at where this is happening. So if you look at countries like Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and Hong Kong, Macau, these are the places where the migration was restricted before, particularly during the Cold War. Very few people actually can move into these countries and becoming workers. But then these countries now open up. They are the model of a developmental state. They made themselves into somebody in a very short period of time and during the Cold War. And then they started to import people in order to do jobs that local people don't want to do. So in that sense, are they really pro-migration or anti-migration? Then you have to look at what kind of people are welcomed by them. So if you're white, if you're highly skilled, if you're having a lot of capital, if you can make profit, you can make contribution in any possible way defined by the government, you're most welcome. So we're actually very pro-migration. But if you are poor, you're from Southeast Asia, you are seen as contagious, hence before you can come in you have to have a lot of health examination that adds more cost to the cost of being mobile, then we are very anti-migration, because we don't want these people to come, in spite of the fact that these people do the jobs that local people don't want to do because it's dirty, dangerous, and difficult. So I understand from economic sense. Of course, we want to make people cheap. That's how everybody of us can enjoy that profit, can enjoy very well-made public construction work, high-speed railway, improved harbour, power plant. But then, what is that built on? And I found this is if in countries in the global north, we actually have started 30 years ago, the so-called compassion fatigue. Then the compassion fatigue even haven't taken place in those newly formed migration states in South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong, the North State. So I think this issue, I was very frustrated because on the one hand, you know, empirically, you need these things, but that challenges your sense of humanity. And I hope that later the film will show you. The film will show you that you've been challenged by how you see yourself as a human being. If you could, I think our film director told us in the case of Taiwan, you have loads of people, those women working in your home, looking after your parents. I myself benefit from that because I am an immigrant to this country. I wasn't at home. And so when my mom and dad died, as another woman looking after my mom and dad. Why is that? Because we can't provide that kind of care for our parents and would buy a woman's cheap labor from Southeast Asia to look after our parents. I will mention this when in a conference I went 3 years ago, a professor said to me that, I said, well, Professor, what are you doing here in London? He said, oh, after conference I go sightseeing. Just a shame my wife couldn't come because our domestic worker ran away. So my wife has to stay home to look after my parents. Otherwise, she'll be here with me. So you see that emotional labor, care labor, domestic labor has become so much being into this hierarchy. Our women are so important for making economic profit. Hence, we buy cheaper women's labor from Southeast Asia to look after our parents. And I found that I can understand that because of an army of domestic workers in Taiwan look after our parents when we are aging and we are aged. But at what cost? And how can we live with that kind of a reality that human beings are so much lower because they are domestic workers or they're care workers from Southeast Asia? That we are not even talking about refugees. We're just talking about people who provide that kind of labor in order to make another group of families or women can live a proper normal life. And I found that it's something that makes me unable to even sleep whenever I think about it. Sorry, I become emotional.
No, thank you. It's, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I was reading this paper the other day that actually the liberal or authoritarian nature of a regime makes basically no overall difference when you look at it globally as to the ease of admission policies across a lot of areas, because authoritarian regimes can do certain profit-seeking things that may be unpopular, but they can do it. And I guess this gets to kind of Christian's point, which is that in democracies there is this problem or this trend in the wrong direction, or the normative case hasn't been working, right? Let's kind of say a couple of things about that. First is I don't think that empirical arguments do any better at convincing people than normative ones overall, or myth making, right? About combining a narrative, empirical, or something like that. And I also don't see it as this is exactly not working, right? Because as I was saying, there are more pro-immigrant people in a lot of societies where this has been controversial than there used to be. If you look if you look behind the curtain, that's, it's certainly not a lack of people who agree with at least some of these arguments. What's happened is that the politics of it have gotten intensified, but that is not, that is happening for different reasons of political organization. Doesn't relate to whether or not the debate is being won. But that only points to the fact that you can't simply win the debate. You might have a shrinking amount of the population that feels that rejects these normative arguments about immigrants. If they're all organized into a single party that wins 27% in your election, when you have 11 parties in parliament, as you just had in the Netherlands, then you have an issue. And that's increasingly the type of thing that's happened, but that's not quite the same as the larger discourse.
Well, thank you. First, I would like to thank the panel. I think it's very intelligently putting things in context and certainly helped me to see things slightly more clearly. I really like the idea about changing the narratives. And I think when I'm kind of reflecting also on the documentary, I was thinking the changing narratives, not only about the narratives of immigrants or refugees, but perhaps the narratives about the host country. Certainly, actually, with the statistics that we have seen, putting in thing context, actually, okay, the host country, the silent majority, in fact, probably more pro and more welcoming than we may have portrayed there. So, and by do not let the guilt or the kind of a moral standards, kind of a dual talking on behalf of the research. By doing that, in fact, you're also polarizing the issue itself and creating that chasm between, the immigrants and the whole country. And that may not be the most helpful thing. And that, I think, more specifically, I was also looking at the documentary, certainly was very challenging viewing. And when you do not actually have this more clarity of thinking, very easy to guilt yourself thinking, oh, we are all kind of in a fault. But in fact, if we deal with issue by issue, this is a very specific case. It's not something that happens in Taiwan every day, for example. And also, like Isabel was mentioning, in terms of your case, okay, in terms of paying immigrants to look after the elderly parents, take that away. So what do you propose? What is the better scenario? What's your solution? Will there ever any solution not make him feel guilty? So if we take that away, then perhaps we can also deal with issues with some distance and perhaps more constructive manner. If there are policy that has holes, then perhaps it's easier to suggest certain policies that actually need to be remedied rather than making it overarching that the whole society is in the wrong and doing certain section of the people injustice that perhaps really going to confuse the issue and cloudy the matter. So yeah, so that's my comment. Thank you.
Can I comment?
Yeah, of course.
I think as long as the key problem in here is that when the policymakers, maybe they're deliberate or not, I'm not sure anymore, but the root causes of migration are usually dismissed. That's the problem. I mean, as long as we've got conflicts, you said climate refugees, it's a little fraction that is just newly emerging literature that we can see, but I agree with you in that line, although it's not my research area, but I agree on that. But we've got conflicts in so many regions, and it will produce refugees. And as you said, usually they go to the neighboring countries, and usually it's the developing countries. Usually they are also are impacted by the conflict itself as well, on top of the global issues that we have, pandemic, we have global economic crisis, and every global economic crisis, is costly for certain countries more than others, I would argue. So that produces different types of human statuses, I would argue. So, and it is costly on humans who are forced to move, actually, rather than choosing. So there's a big difference in that. I think that's one of the key issues. I just wanted to comment that root causes of migration is usually dismissed. And that is the key reason why we have these legal statuses categories that you just mentioned. That's the reason. I mean, even though you're a voluntary migrant, in my book I say voluntary and involuntary migrants, that's very blurred. You might voluntarily choose into through a legal route. You might be going into a country to work, but as you said, you might be going because of the economic conundrum that you're having. If you stay, with your family, you're going to go through an economic, issue, a financial problems. You have to go. Sounds like, you're paying for it, you're going through legal routes, and you're legit economic migrant. But that's a conflict within itself as well. So I think looking at, yes, particular areas is important, but at the same time looking at the broader picture, a global picture, and what structural problems we've got. As I said initially, do we need to revisit the nation state, the modern nation state system and borders that you mentioned as well, borders that we've got more walls now, concrete walls now. Turkey had open border policy in the beginning, and then everybody was really praising that open border policy. How nice country is, and as host country, because they were guests. Since 2011, they're not guests anymore. So they're following the UNHCR durable solutions now, which means they have to integrate them, which is a problematic term as well, but I'm not going to get into that. But they have to integrate them economically, socially, and legally, properly, because they're not going back. There's a myth that they're going back, but the conflict is still there. If they go back, either they're going to be persecuted, killed, or whatever going to happen. It's not safe. There's no economic means to live in Syria anymore. So they're in Turkey to stay. So you need to find solutions on that. Although I said in my talk, I don't like the terminology, approach to this problem to be solved. That's the terminology now we have until we change the narrative. And then just small comment on your, dichotomous type of approaches is that we've got ontology of containment. That's Seyla Benem, I think she puts in that way. And then rather than, we continuously focus on the receiving countries. I think that's one of your points. We continuously do that, we're going to get this number of people coming in. And then, well, the myth that we didn't even touch upon, they're going to steal our native workers' jobs, which usually is not the case many times, or all times is not the case. And all these myths that are happening to receiving countries, to host countries, not the sending countries. Not many, there is breadth of literature on brain drain, remittances and other areas that look into origin countries, but not in the media, not in the stats that are actually spreading scaremongering about how many people are coming and doing all these bad stuff. We didn't even get into cultural, issues, how multiculturalism is being revisited and then in a negative way, I should say. So yeah, I think narrative is really important. How we put into words is really important. Yeah.
I don't want to eat people's time for drinks, but I thought I was responding to Mia's question. Indeed, I sound very emotional because this is how I got motivated to do this research. After my mom died, then I talked to a care worker, and I realized that is a very inhumane system, but that doesn't mean that we cannot find solutions. So I think the solution is to, first of all, if we look at the domestic workers, is to make it a proper job. Because still today, I don't know about in the Western context, but in the case of Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and perhaps less in Japan and South Korea, domestic work is still seen as women's work. So there's no legal protection. They are not considered workers, so there's no right associated with their work. So I think this kind of labor, this kind of emotional labor should be properly recognized as labor and as something that can be regulated. And so there's certain kinds of rights can be provided. One very simple thing is to having day off. Because still today, they have no right to have a day off, and that is just depending on the mercy of their employers. So I think this, to me, of course, this is a very personal issue, but reality is in Taiwan, if you consider that there are more than 300,000 families hiring a woman at their home to do this kind of work for them, then you realize that is needed. So that's what I wanted to say, maybe not very expressed very well. We need these workers, we appreciate their work, but we suppress their costs at a very low level, hence people can afford it. Hence 300,000 families can afford it, and hence 300,000 families can also use them to do other kind of work. They're being known as overworked. So if this kind of work, if just simply domestic work can be better regulated, then we're actually creating happy workers. We need happy workers to do better jobs, rather than oppressed workers and having mental health problem, and then create, I shouldn't say create problem, making this work very unsustainable. So that is my, beyond being very emotionally involved, morally feeling guilty. I did tell my students the reason why I do this research is like serving a lifelong sentence. I tell people about that all the time. Yeah, this is, and then the more I do understand it, perhaps it helps them with the advocacy and feel a bit better. But that's just a very personal.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we'll have to finish there because there is some refreshments over in the Stephen Langton building. We'll be reconvening here for 5:30 for the screening of the film, followed by a Q&A with the director. I mean, thanks very much. I thought that was a really fascinating, insightful. I was very struck, if I can just say one comment. I mean, I think the issue of care is so important, and as a concept, it's not something I think that is valued as much. And there is a body of scholarship now emerging to think much more about care, both as a profession and both also as a practice in terms of care for the environment and care for people itself. So, but anyway, on that note, can I just say thank you to our panelists. Thanks very much.